Hello, I'm Pastor Jane Ellingwood, the Interim Associate Minister for the First Congregational Church of Ridgefield in Connecticut. My meditation for this Sunday, August 16th, 2020, is based on Genesis chapter 21, verses 8 to 21. This is one of the stories in Genesis about Hagar and her son Ishmael, who was Abraham's firstborn son. But the opening words about a child are about Isaac, the son of Abraham, and Sarah. Let us hear these words from the book of Genesis. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made him a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water, and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, a good way off, about the distance of a bowshot, for she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Here ends the reading. Well, I first learned about the stories of Hagar and Ishmael. There was more than one. They're all related stories in the book of Genesis. When I took a course from a Jewish professor at Hartford Seminary, it was on religion, conflict, and peacemaking. The professor, Yeheskel Landau, was at the time the director of the Building Abrahamic Partnerships program, which was a program for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. I was not in that program, but as part of my master's program, and also when I went on to my PhD, I was able to take some courses and sit in on some seminar sessions. And I was very grateful for that interfaith opportunity. I was interested in what I learned from Yeheskel about peacemaking approaches among Israelis and Palestinians, including Christians and Muslims and Jews, and he's been involved in this work for many decades. But what I remember the most was how he taught us how to look at Genesis. He taught us to read Genesis and see things that we sometimes don't see if we're reading through other lenses. And these are things that are actually there in Genesis, in the Bible, not things we read into it. These are things that sometimes are actually overlooked or ignored because maybe they don't fit with the storyline. He then showed us ways in which these ancient stories can be rediscovered today and used in interfaith dialogue and understanding. I think these are very good uses for the stories of Hagar and Ishmael, but I have to say that these stories, particularly of Hagar and Ishmael, have been used and misused, interpreted and reinterpreted and misinterpreted, added to and subtracted from for many, many centuries by all three of the major Abrahamic faiths. I can't go into those interpretations today, but I do recommend an essay written by feminist theologians and professors Phyllis Tribble and Letty Russell in the book they edited, Hagar, Sarah, and Their Children, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Perspectives. I thank Deanie for pointing me to this book, and I thank Lynette for recommending the book Sarah Laughed by Jewish professor Vanessa Oakes, which includes a chapter on Hagar. I chose the stories of Hagar and Ishmael for us for this Sunday as part of my 3-week sermon series on new beginnings and second chances, and also as a lead up to the series on Exodus that James and I are going to do when he comes back from vacation, and which I'll be launching next week. Hagar and her son were certainly given a second chance on new life when God heard their cries. God opened Hagar's eyes to the sight of a well when they thought they were dying of thirst in the wilderness, and Hagar and Ishmael drank from the life-giving water. Unfortunately, one of the tragic parts of this story, even beyond the fact that Abraham sent Hagar and Ishmael away, is that they were only given a skin of water and just a little bit of food, and they evidently didn't know where to go in the wilderness to find water. I find it hard to accept that they were treated this way, which seems to be inhumane. I ask myself whether Abraham might not have been better to have given them more water, more food, and more direction as to where to go so that they could fill up again. However, on the other hand, one of the things I wanted to point out today, and this is part of what I take away from these stories, both Hagar and Abraham at separate times had been given promises by God about God's plans for Ishmael's future. It's possible that they didn't really think, even if they had forgotten the promises, or at least Abraham might not have thought that Ishmael was going to die. So let's go back. We have to go a little bit earlier in Genesis. We were in chapter 21. We need to go back to chapter 16. This is where the story is told of Abraham's wife Sarah not being able to conceive a child. Sarah gave Hagar, who was her slave, to Abraham for her to try to conceive. Hagar is what we would call today one of the first handmaids. According to the story, Hagar began to look on Sarah with contempt because Hagar was able to conceive and Sarah was not. Unfortunately, this enraged Sarah, and she treated Hagar very harshly, and so Hagar ran away, and she was in the wilderness a first time. But here too, on this first time, she was blessed by God, just as she was in the story we heard today. An angel of the Lord found her in the wilderness, and on the bad side, the angel told her, go back to Sarah, submit to your mistress. This is what we want to do. That wasn't good. But the angel of the Lord also said to Hagar, I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. So Hagar returned to Sarah and Abraham, and her child Ishmael was born. Then in the next chapter, still before ours, God tells Abraham that Sarah is going to have a son. This one will be Isaac, and God promises to make an everlasting covenant with Isaac and his offspring. God also says that God would bless Sarah and that she shall give rise to nations through her son Isaac. Now Abraham on the good side was actually worried what was going to happen to Ishmael, the firstborn son, and he put in a plea to God that Ishmael might live in God's sight, even though God wanted to make the covenant with Isaac. So God then promised Abraham that Ishmael would be the father of 12 princes and that God would make him a great nation. So there were the promises that had taken place. They had been given to both Hagar and Abraham. I can't say whether or not Hagar and Abraham remembered them at the time of our story, and I'm pretty sure that Sarah probably didn't know about these promises that God made about Ishmael, because I suspect she might have felt a little bit more jealous even than she did. But I think that God remembered his promises. God, as we saw in the story today, God took care of both Hagar and Ishmael after they had been sent away. I think, and for those of you who either were on the Zoom church last Sunday or listened to my sermon, we talked about Noah and his family. I think this concept of God remembering the covenants, God remembering Hagar and Ishmael, even if it had been a few years. This is like the concept I mentioned last week that's in Genesis of God having remembered Noah and his family, and all the animals were in the ark. They were all alone in the waters that rose above them. And all of a sudden that Genesis says, and God remembered them. Now, this kind of remembering, as we said last week, doesn't really mean that God ever forgets. This kind of remembering is part of God's faithfulness to people and to creation, and it means that God is faithful to prior promises and blessings. So in our story today, we heard God saying again to Abraham that God would make a nation out of Ishmael. This may have been why Abraham was able to send Ishmael and Hagar away. It might have represented Abraham's faith in God, which he also had when it seemed that God wanted him to sacrifice his son Isaac. And I would just mention that that story comes up in the very next chapter, after the one that we heard today. Then the angel of God in our story spoke to Hagar and calmed her fears, and she and Ishmael had been crying, but they stopped crying and they had water to drink. The angel of God also said to her, "Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." This part of the story ends by saying that God was with the boy and the boy grew up. God had remembered God's promises and God was with God's peoples. So later on, when we next hear of Ishmael, now, very interesting, he and his stepbrother Isaac, who had been separated, were burying their father Abraham in the cave where Sarah was buried. You have to admit that this suggests that Isaac and Ishmael hadn't really stayed that far apart, and they must have lived close enough to be in communication with each other. This is one of those sometimes overlooked tidbits from Genesis that I learned from Yehuska Landau so many years ago in the course I took. I also learned from him that in some rabbinic interpretations of Genesis later on, Hagar is thought to reappear in Genesis as Abraham's wife Keturah, whom he married after Sarah died. The 6 sons that Keturah bore to Abraham are named just before the story tells of Ishmael and Isaac burying their father. Hagar isn't actually mentioned there or again, and one can only wonder if she and Abraham ever saw each other again. In bringing the stories of these people to an end, Genesis said that before Abraham died, he gave almost all that he had to Isaac because of the covenant. But it also says that Abraham gave gifts to the 6 sons of Keturah, although he asked them to settle to the east away from Isaac. This turns out to be in Arabia or in the Arabian Peninsula. Then the 12 sons of Ishmael, who were descendants of Hagar and Abraham, are then named in the same story, and they became 12 princes according to their tribes, and they settled near the Sinai and Syrian deserts. And Ishmael died and was gathered to his peoples. As these stories in Genesis go, God not only gave a second chance of living to Hagar and Ishmael when they were thirsty and hungry and near death in the wilderness, God also brought new peoples, tribes, and nations into being through the descendants of Abraham, through 3 different mothers. First Keturah, then Sarah. First Hagar, then Sarah, and then Keturah. God gave new beginnings to people as individuals and to groups of people. The primary storyline of the primary covenant does continue in Genesis and later in the Bible through Isaac and his descendants. But God made other promises and offered to bless other peoples and parts of creation. We saw this last week when we talked about the universal covenant that God had made after the flood with Noah, with all human beings, with all living creatures, and with the earth. And we see it again this week. Next week, we are going to be discussing the birth of the baby Moses and his rescue from a basket in the Nile River. I would suggest to us as we move forward in time and the people of Israel are rescued from slavery and brought through the wilderness and into lands that are new to them, I think that it will be good for us to remember all of God's promises and blessings and not just the ones that come down through Isaac. Other people lived in the territories through which Moses and the people traveled or in which they stayed for a while. And some of these people were descendants of Abraham, even if they descended through Hagar or Keturah rather than Sarah. I'll leave you with one other tidbit as one example. In the passage from Exodus that comes directly after the one that we'll be reading next week, Moses has grown up. He's only discussed as a baby for a short time. He's grown into a man and he has to flee Egypt. He takes shelter in the land of Midian. He meets and is taken in by the priest of Midian, and he marries Zipporah, one of the priest's daughters. The Midianites who lived in this land are said to be descendants of the person named Midian, who was one of the 6 sons of Keturah and Abraham. And they were helping Moses as he was about to take his own place in God's ongoing stories of rescues and new beginnings, as God created new peoples and took them into new places on their journeys. May we honor the God of faithfulness and steadfast love, who can work through us and is with all of God's peoples. Amen.